I'm standing on the ice a few miles from the North Pole. The sun is setting very slowly. It's almost on the horizon. As it's descending, the wind is dropping, the light's going. I can feel the strength of the sun diminishing. As it sets, the light goes, but it doesn't get dark. We have 24-hour daylight here, so although I can't see the sun, there is still daylight. It is a most unusual situation. It's very difficult to comprehend. I like doing adventurous things. When I went to Antarctica, going across the Drake Passage in something like force 11 gales, that was quite an experience. With ballooning and like gliding, I took up gliding before I did ballooning, and that's a great challenge, being able to keep the glider up in the air for hours on end, where you're searching out air currents, you're searching out thermals. That is a considerable challenge. When I do races, half marathons or marathons now, they're a challenge, they're an adventure, because you're running hard, conditions change as you're doing a race. The challenge there is to finish it in a good time. So I do like challenges. Ballooning can be tranquil. As going to the North Pole, there are times of tranquility, the peace. That was great. But I don't go to places for the tranquility. I go for the challenge, be it against myself to do better times in running, or to set records in ballooning, or to trek to the pole. I like to set myself something that needs to be beaten. I underwent a lot of training to go to the North Pole. I wanted to be really fit to go there. When you're fit, the body's prepared for have more flung at it. In 2009, a year before I went there, I did my second marathon. And then come the autumn, I linked some tyres from the tyre shop and attached them to a harness that I'd got and practiced towing tyres around Linfield Common, which is just outside the door here. And it caused quite a bit of amusement when we had about 10 centimetres of snow, and I was trudging round with snow boots and shorts because it was hot work pulling the tyres. One lady asked me quite flippantly, what was I training for? And I, for some reason, I don't know why the reply came up, but I said, life membership at the Funny Farm. And she thought that was quite amusing. I got involved with some students from Brighton University and was invited to go in the cold chamber that they have at Eastbourne. The cold chamber was used to show me what it's like for onset hypothermia. The chamber was set at about -7, and I went into the chamber wearing my running shorts and vest. And every 15 minutes they would ask me simple tests like arithmetic, to repeat a sentence, and it was after about 45 minutes that the brain started to slow down. But it was quite interesting watching this hypothermia creep in. And the whole idea was so I'd recognise it if I got really cold on the trek to the North Pole. They said the best thing to do if I was cold would be to get in a sleeping bag with somebody else with minimal clothing on, get close to them and warm up gently inside 1 or 2 sleeping bags. And my temperature only dropped about 2.5, 3 degrees. So imagine what it would be like if I'd been stuck out there and body temperature was down more than that. The trek to the North Pole was organised by David Hempelman Adams. He's been to the North and South Poles many times, and he recruited a guide that he's known well, the chap who took him to the North Pole, called Rune Yildiz, who's an expert guide. He's trekked solo right the way across Antarctica. He trains Norwegian troops on Arctic survival, and he was guiding 4 of us. There was David Newman, who ran a company in Manchester. There was Paul Strasburger, who's in his early 60s, and his stepdaughter Alice. Alice was just 17, plus of course yours truly. We were going to get there by air. The way I went with the team was via Heathrow to Oslo, overnight at Oslo, and then from Oslo on an internal flight to Tromsø, and then on to the island of Spitsbergen, where we land at Longyearbyen. And we were going to overnight there, and then the next morning a Russian former military aeroplane arrived. It's a twin-engine jet, an Antonov 74, can take 10 tons. Off it went to fly us 2 hours to a camp they call Barneo on the ice, approximately 89 degrees north. It's put there every March. The equipment is parachuted in. They fly some helicopters, they hedge hop from the northern territories across the water to the ice. The Russians parachute in a bulldozer when they've identified an area that is suitable for their aircraft to land on, and it then levels it. And this is set up every year for about a month. And interestingly, the navigator had to navigate the aircraft to land on a white runway on a white piece of ice that's floating and not in the same place twice. It's always moving. But we got there and the aircraft landed very well. Now, the first thing that struck me when we landed there was how warm it was. Far too warm. In fact, it was only -3, which is worryingly warm for that area. The Met officer came and gave everybody a briefing, and he said that the conditions are deteriorating and everybody is to stay at that camp overnight because they couldn't do any rescue facilities because the wind was picking up, it was going to snow, and the visibility was going to drop, and you needed the visibility so that we didn't go and walk or ski into a gap between the ice sheets. In fact, the visibility dropped down to about 25 meters, 20 to 25 meters, and we ended up unfortunately staying in that camp for 2 nights. My sight problem is down to an inherited fault in the mitochondrial DNA. It's called Leber's hereditary optic neuropathy, and the medics have given it a number as well. It's 11778, whatever that means. I'm registered blind, but I'm severely sight impaired, which is the same thing. So I'm classed as blind, but I'm not blind. Only, believe it or not, only 4% of people who are registered blind are actually completely blind. Most people have some ability to make things out of one degree or another. So I'm fortunate that I'm severely sight impaired and not blind.
So it's the first day. Finally it's good weather, and we have 43 nautical miles to the pole at the moment, going in that direction. So the first day, do you think we do 6 hours?
Once we had left the Russian camp Barneo, we were out on our own. Just a shame that we lost those days because of the weather, but nothing you could do about it, and we just had to make up the best time we could. We stopped after an hour to have our munchies and also to adjust our clothing, and I had too much on. I didn't realise how much warmer it was than I'd planned for. After about 4 hours, we had our first obstacle, a gap in the ice. They call them leads because the North Pole is made up of thousands of ice sheets of varying sizes, some several square kilometres. and they don't always come together, so we're actually floating on the Arctic Sea. There are a few risks involved in this, but one is we could possibly end up getting trapped on an ice sheet, because whilst we're on it, it could separate from the others, and the gap between the sheets of ice could be too large for us to cross. The only thing to do with this one was to trek alongside it until it was narrow enough to jump over. We'd take the skis off, strap them to the pulks, and the pulks between the leading edge of the pulk and the harness was about 6 meters of line. And so we bring the pulk to the edge of the gap in the ice, the lead, and we go back as far as we could and then run as fast as we could and leap over the gap and then keep running, and then the slack would be taken up and we'd jolt the pulk over the gap, and then we just keep running to get it clear of the gap and then wait for the next person. We also encountered a small ice ridge. Now if you can imagine, just the same as icebergs, 90% of the sheet of ice is underwater, and so when the sea is flowing, the Arctic Sea is flowing, it's pushing the ice sheets along, and the wind on the top will be getting hold of rough bits and helping push. So when one ice sheet bumps into another, something has to give, and quite often the ice rises up and breaks, so you get these ridges of rubble, and the blocks of ice that form this ice rubble can be really, really big. I mean, some of them are the size of houses, detached houses, or even terrace of houses. Other lumps were just small, maybe the size of a fist. Alice did express some concern, but she was only 17. You could actually hear one sheet rubbing on another. It was best described as a graunching sound, and that upset her a bit, worried her a bit. And we go on all fours and pull the pulk by hand. It would rock and roll. We climb over these blocks of ice. Once we're all clear, skis go back on and off we go again and make up for lost time, and also correct our course. Because you imagine, we weren't actually walking straight to the pole, we were having to zigzag to get over the leads or to get over the ice rubble. Anyway, great news. At the end of the first day we set up the tent, and then Rune, our guide, got his GPS out and he said, that 6 hours we've now trekked 5.7 miles nearer the pole. So not great, but you can see how we've lost distance by zigzagging. But it's just a lovely feeling being up there. It's unlike anywhere else. No noise pollution, no aeroplanes, no contrails in the sky, nothing. And also too far north to see the northern lights, the aurora borealis, I think they call it. We were past that belt, so we couldn't see it. I had to get used to it, had to adapt my life, had to change various things. And at that point I was declared severely sight impaired, which is the same thing as being registered blind, and that's what they called me. They gave me a blind registration card. I felt quite upset, and I got off the train. I thought, right, a brisk walk back to the house, 1.5 miles, and I stopped at the local pub and had a chat with some friends and a pint, and thought, right, we've got to sort this out. Can't let this defeat me. If I look up, I can now make out the shape of the camera, because the bottom of the periphery is working better, but the core bit is no good. So I walk with a white stick, because that's the only way I cross the road, and it's the only way I wouldn't bump into people, because they wouldn't know otherwise, and they'd wonder why I didn't move out of the way, or why did I cross in front of the car, and things like that. The next morning, hot drink, got the kettle going, and then there were some rude comments. Overnight, the ice sheet on which we'd camped had drifted 7 miles away from the pole. So we'd spent the whole of the previous day trekking to end up 1 mile further away than we'd started, 1.3 miles further away. So we weren't best pleased, but there's not much you could do about it except get a move on the next day. And that's what we did. We set off and trekked as hard as we could towards the pole. That afternoon, for some reason, I wasn't immediately following Runa, our guide. I was about a metre or so off to the right of his track, and that was enough, because all of a sudden there was a cracking noise and I dropped through the ice. It turned out to be too thin and I went into the cold Arctic water underneath the ice. Oh, that's a difficult question. No, I'm not sure I could answer that. There's so much to see, you know. Somebody once asked me if there was one thing that I would like to be able to see, what would it be? It's a very difficult question to answer, as life isn't just one thing, it's all sorts. I've run a very quick marathon, 3 hours 6 minutes, which put me third in the country in my age group at the end of that race, and I did that without being able to see where I'm going. And doing something like that makes me wonder what sort of time I could have done had I been able to see. So rather than answer the question of what one thing would I like to see, it would be more how being able to see properly would bolster my ability to do things. So it'd be more broad spectrum rather than saying I'd like to see one particular thing. And that was enough, because all of a sudden there was a cracking noise and I dropped through the ice. It turned out to be too thin and I went into the cold Arctic water underneath the ice. And it was rather a shock to the system, and I immediately thought, how far am I going down? Fortunately my pulk didn't come in with me and the broken ice supported me, so I didn't go right down. But the others came. I flung myself onto my chest. The training is you go onto your chest, you try and freeze your jacket or whatever you've got onto the ice, and then you hold the ski sticks further out for people to grab so they don't come near the edge and go in themselves. I was hauled out. At that point I felt a sort of sense of relief that I was back on firmer ice. It was a bit of a shock to the system, and then instinct and survival kicked in, and I got on with the process of being recovered. The trek for that afternoon, the rest of that afternoon, wasn't so good because my feet were very, very cold from the cold that was in the wet liners. So it was a relief when we set up tent and I could get into a sleeping bag and warm my feet, because they did take some warming at that point. I mean, another weird aspect of this Leber's hereditary optic neuropathy is as the sight was deteriorating, I was seeing tiny little flashing lights. The best way to describe it would be like a fireworks show. You've got all these lights just flashing about all over the place, and if I was in a room that was white, that was when it was at its worst. If I looked at a blank wall, then you'd see the flashes all over the place, totally random. Quite weird. And fortunately, that I was told would take a couple of years or so to die down. I met other people with Leber's and they found exactly the same thing, that it's really quite strange when you're sat there on your own or with people but not talking, and you see these fireworks shows. it was another day, another challenge. We've got to get going, we've got to get a move on, we've got to ski hard to make up for the time we lost, particularly on day one. I really quite enjoyed bashing on and trekking, and if people did ask me was I afraid at all, and I said no. I just felt that everything would be hunky-dory one way or the other. Here we are in the afternoon of the 5th day of trekking. We've set up camp and we're taking stock of the situation. We were trapped by areas of water to the west and to the north, so we're having to go as east as far as we can in order to head north. Hopefully tomorrow morning we'll find a bridge, or the ice will have moved close together so that we can get across the lead. We are currently at latitude 89, 32, 40. So we've a little way to go yet, and 3 more days of walking. With a little bit of help from the wind, we should be able to make it. It's been a great trip, and the scenery must be stunning for those who can fully appreciate it. One of the other team members kept saying that his feet were cold, and after 3 hours or 4 hours of saying 3 hours saying his feet were cold, Runa stopped the trek. We set up the tent, and he and Paul, the other chap on the trek, went into the tent, and he took his boots and socks off and warmed his feet on the tummy of Paul. He'd got quite a big tummy, and over a few hours, a couple of hours or so, the feet were warmed up gently and then put into clean dry socks. Ironically, the reason that happened was that his boot liners and my boot liners got muddled up, and my feet were smaller, and so his toes were pushing against the edge, so the insulation was compressed, and that's how his feet got cold. But by doing that, we prevented his toes from getting frostbitten. So that was the closest any of us got to it. Having put the tent up, it became too windy to continue the trek, unless we were to do without the tent for shelter, because how do you put a tent up on ice, which doesn't take tent pegs, in winds of 35 knots? So we'd been warned, and so we all stayed in the tent. I didn't find that a problem. Some people thought it might be a problem, but you chat, you rest, you sleep, and we were quite happy. We started to look forward to the moment when the wind would drop enough and the visibility would improve so we could set off again. But I didn't mind just lying in the sleeping bag out of the wind. Here we are in our tent on the Tuesday evening of the 13th of April. We've been in here all day today because the weather has been atrocious. Extremely strong winds, gusts well over 30 miles an hour. And as you can probably hear, it's still blowing like a goodness knows what. We're hoping the weather will abate tomorrow so that we can make progress, as we've only got 2 more full days to go. We are relaxing between courses. We're about to enjoy packet number 2. We don't know what surprises are in store.
Yes, we do. Yes, we do.
It's either apple and custard, or it's custard and apple.
Or mixed berries, or rice pudding. We have a choice.
Any comment,
It's not a
Dave?
very good one.
Well, I quite like the apple and custard.
It's
So
true.
much, I have it for breakfast as well.
So, for tomorrow, hopefully we'll find a crossing. We will see.
Hello, here we are on Wednesday evening in the tent. We haven't walked anywhere today. The weather's been appalling. Extremely strong winds, gusting quite severely. On leaving the tent, the wind chill factor is quite extreme, so we've stayed put. Whilst there, I rang Deborah, my partner, from the satellite phone, and she was really taken aback, quite surprised to be phoned from a few miles from the North Pole, and she did think though that I sounded cold, but she was really surprised and pleased that I'd rung. That's the only time she'd received a phone call from me up near the North Pole. When I took my partner Deborah up for her first flight, she was looking down at the houses and farms, and her thoughts were similar to mine. What's that house doing there? Why don't we pick it up and move it and put it in the corner there? That'd be more sensible. It's almost as if it's a model and you want to rearrange it. The air was so clear that that night, as I flew through the night, I saw more shooting stars than any other time, because all the light pollution is way down beneath me, and all I'm doing is looking through darkness from darkness. On our last day trekking, when we got up with lots of energy, raring to go to try and get to the pole, although it did seem to be quite a distance, backed away, we set off, and after things were going well for a while, we hit this open water, this lead that was quite wide, and we had two ways to go. Obviously, we went one way, went to the left. We trekked for 3.5 hours, hoping that the gap would get narrower and narrower. Unfortunately, it didn't. We were talking about a gap of hundreds, maybe 200-300 meters wide, and there's no way we could cross that. And we were starting to get a bit despondent, thinking we're not going to get to the pole on foot because of the fact that the gap was so wide and wasn't getting narrower.
This is Craig Newman from near the North Pole. Been quite a long couple of days for us in that we haven't made that much progress. The weather has conspired against us, or continued to conspire against us. We started at a reasonable time, but spent 3 hours trying to get through and around lots of open water, and we effectively got zeroed out, which meant that there was no route forward. Longitude and latitude is currently north 89 degrees, 34 minutes, 0.321 seconds, east 103 degrees, 48 minutes, 0.897 seconds, and we're drifting very fast.
We were constrained by time in that we had to be back at Spitsbergen on a certain day, which meant leaving the ice on a certain day. So we couldn't really afford the luxury of staying on the ice for any longer. So as this helicopter was planned and was already going to be taking people to and bringing us from the North Pole, Runa decided the only thing to do was to give them our position, and he tell them that we would need to be collected, and that's what happened. If we had turned right and trekked going right along parallel with the lead, I did wonder, and still wonder, whether we might have come across a narrower part and had been able to cross so that we could continue trekking. But you know, you can't live with what ifs, because otherwise, you know, you'll be restless all the time. When the helicopter landed, we climbed aboard, and a few minutes later, literally a few minutes, because we weren't far from the pole, we were there. On a previous expedition, the ice drifted the other way. So when they set off from the camp, all of the ice sheets were drifting towards the pole. And they got to the pole in 3 days. Whereas we were there 10 days and didn't get quite there. It's luck of the draw. We lost 5 trackable days because of poor weather, and that is a large loss. But you know, if it had been good weather all the time and the ice hadn't moved and we hadn't had ice gaps, we would have got there in 4 days. But there's nothing that I could have done about it, nothing anybody could have done about it. It was just nature, bit of global warming, meaning the ice hadn't formed as thoroughly as we'd hoped. And the way things are going at the moment, there won't be a North Pole there in a few years' time. Apparently, at New Year this year, it was plus 3 degrees at the North Pole. So I'm glad I went when I did. After the helicopter landed, it was quite fun apparently to see Hempelman Adams and a Russian, each with handheld GPSs, walking about trying to find the exact spot of the North Pole, where it was 90 degrees of latitude, and they were looking for 00 on the longitude, just out of curiosity. And eventually they piled up a bit of snow and stuck a spike in and said, at this moment in time, this is the North Pole. Probably in 10 minutes' time that will have drifted a few metres, and therefore it wouldn't be the North Pole. But you've got to grin and bear that. Once Hempy and the Russian had pinpointed the position of the North Pole with their 2 GPSs, the Russians wheeled out this big canister so we could celebrate being on top of the world at the most northerly point with a mug of hot mulled wine. It was a nice touch to have mulled wine at that latitude. My 21-hour non-stop balloon flight was a challenge. My 3-hour, 6-minute marathon was a challenge. And my trek to the North Pole was an extreme challenge. I don't like it when people say, oh, you can't see, you can't do this, or you can't do that. Should we take the lift? I said, no, we take the stairs. Once I found the first step, and when I know where the last step is, I'm fine. You know, if I can run marathons, if I can go to the North Pole, everybody's challenges are different. And each person, after having a problem with health, for example, should look at what they would like to do. Because what is a challenge for one person may not be for another. So there's no hard and fast. They've got to set themselves a goal that they feel that with some care, with some help initially, they can then overcome and succeed at. You can do an awful lot more than people initially think. I know they mean well, but if somebody has a problem such as sight as I've got, let people decide for themselves. Very important. We were there for a couple of hours, just enjoying a feeling of euphoria, a feeling of relaxation, of quietness. The fact that there was no other noise around whatsoever, no other sign of habitation of any sort, no animals, no birds, no contrails in the sky, nothing. Very, very peaceful. When the wind dies down, it was almost a surreal feeling. It was a feeling of euphoria in many ways, that to be on the top of the world, and just a few thousand, I think only 2,000 people have ever been to the North Pole, and it was absolutely amazing feeling. Despite the wind, it was emotional being up on the ice. So it was really quite unusual. I don't know anywhere else in the world where that's possible.